In this video, we're going to be discussing forest management practices. And there are some pictures on this slide that show some of the array of different practices that are forest management practices, such as use of prescribed fire, tree planting, site preparation, burn, to begin to prepare a site for the next stand, and application of herbicides to control brush and weeds for a planned plantation. There are some major categories or groupings of management activities, and notice that the first one is not actually a management activity, but it's a human choice, that is, making the choice of regeneration method to use. Another category of activity is site preparation. Site preparation is often needed to facilitate the regeneration method. So this is at the beginning of the next stand of trees. Then in the beginning years of the stand, the early years of the stand, there are early age management activities, and I've put here if needed. There are a number of them. Some examples, though, might include release or pre-commercial thinning, or use of prescribed fire, such as with longleaf pine when it's in the grass stage. Then another category are activities done in the intermediate ages of the life of a stand, or called intermediate age, for instance, intermediate age stem removal, and that can promote growth on the very best stems. Some examples might be commercial thinnings for pine or improvement cuts for hardwoods. And then the final harvest, and the cycle begins again, because the final harvest can facilitate the next regeneration method. So now we're going to talk about that choice that we had mentioned in the previous slide, choice of regeneration systems, because there are different regeneration systems. The various regeneration systems have different advantages and disadvantages depending on the system. A regeneration system and its choice is the first step to a new forest, and it should consider things like species light requirements of the target species, stand conditions, the soil types, with the objectives of the landowner, and the mode of regeneration. And we'll talk about modes of regeneration a little bit later. In fact, talking about that now with reproduction methods. So we've grouped them here into two broad categories, one called even-aged and the other called uneven-aged. In an even-aged reproduction method, the goal is to have trees be about the same age through the life of a stand, whereas in an uneven-aged type of method for certain kinds of systems, the stands will be of mixed ages, and that can be the goal. So some examples of reproduction methods to achieve even-age stands would include plantation establishment, shelterwood, seed tree, and the practice of doing a clear cut ahead of these three methods: plantation, shelterwood, seed tree. So with a plantation establishment, trees are planted in rows usually, and it follows a clear cut where all timber is removed in a single cutting with In this video, we're going to discuss forest management practices. And these are pictures of some different management practices that can be done during the life of a stand, from use of prescribed fire for wildlife improvement, fuel reduction, just one kind of activity, tree planting. There's another activity. This slide is of a site preparation burn, which is done early in the life of a stand following a final commercial timber harvest. This happens to be a spray to control hardwoods before planting trees. There are some major categories of management activities. Notice the first is activity is a human choice, that is, choosing the regeneration method, and there are a number of considerations that are made in choosing a regeneration method. The second category we call site preparation. Site preparation is done because we need to facilitate, in many cases, the regeneration method that has been chosen. Not always is site preparation necessary, but very often it is. Another category is early age management activities, if they're needed. Some examples include release, pre-commercial thinning, and use of prescribed fire. In this video, we're going to be discussing forest management practices. And these are some examples of different forest management practices. Upper left, use of prescribed fire for fuel reduction or for wildlife enhancement or for eliminating hardwoods encroachment. Lower left, use of herbicides. It can be done for different reasons. Bottom center, site preparation, preparing a fire line and patrolling the fire line when doing a site preparation burn following a final harvest. Upper right, tree planting. There are some major categories of management activities. They include, first, choosing the regeneration method, and there are a number of considerations that should go under the choice of the regeneration method. Then another category is that of site preparation. These are activities that may, but are not necessarily always required to facilitate regeneration method that has been chosen. Then there are activities that can be done during the early years in the life of a stand called early age management activities. Again, much like site preparation, they're done if needed. Some examples would include doing release work to let the preferred young trees grow in free of or somewhat free of competition, or doing pre-commercial thinning, or use of prescribed fire. Then later on in the life of the stand are those intermediate age stem removal activities that are done to promote growth on the very best stem. Some examples for pine might include commercial thinnings, where some trees are removed to give more room to grow for the crop trees, but the trees that are removed in the thinning have value and can be sold and some income made. In the case of hardwoods, they can be different kinds of improvement cuts. And then there's the final harvest that can facilitate the next regeneration method. So we want to talk about regeneration systems. These major systems represent the first step to a new forest and should consider the species light requirements. We talked earlier about sun lovers versus shade lovers versus those that are intermediate in their requirements, the conditions of the stand, the soil types, which we've already seen can be very important and can actually dictate the species that can be economically viable, and then the landowner objectives always, and the mode of regeneration. So let's talk about some modes of regeneration. We're going to group these into two kinds. One we'll call even age, where the goal is to have trees during the life of a stand be pretty much the same age, and we'll put some criteria on those a little bit later. But we can also, for different reasons, have a goal of having trees be a range of ages throughout the life of a stand, and that's called uneven. So for even aged, the reproduction methods can include establishing a plantation where trees are usually planted in rows, or doing a shelterwood system where in the shelterwood system the large timber from the previous stand is removed in stages over a fairly short period of time to accomplish natural regeneration. So trees are left for the purpose of dropping seed to accomplish natural regeneration instead of removing everything and planting trees. Seed tree is also a different reproduction method in which fewer trees from the previous stand, fewer large trees, are left. So in seed tree, all trees except the seed trees themselves, usually maybe 5 to 10 per acre, are removed. And we note that clear cut, which you do for plantation establishment, is when all timber is removed in a single cutting. And then you can plant or you can do some other type of method. An uneven aged grouping, there are two basic types. There is group selection, in which mature timber tends to be removed in small groups or patches, and then single tree selection, where individual trees are targeted and marked and removed on an individual basis. And these reproduction methods do have some advantages and disadvantages, which we'll discuss. I will look a little more at even age management. Let's talk about clear cutting first. When followed by a plantation where trees are planted, is considered to be an intensive management system. So tree plantations are considered intensive systems. When the clear cut is followed by direct seeding instead of planting, where seeds are artificially scattered, they can be scattered by hand with some kind of a seeding device from a tractor that has a seed spreader on it, or can be done by helicopter. But when clear cutting is followed by direct seeding, this too is considered to be an intensive type of management system. Using seed tree, where a relative few number of mature trees are left on site following a final harvest, is considered to be lower intensity than clear cutting, and sometimes the term that's used for low intensive systems are extensive versus intensive systems. So seed tree and also shelterwood are lower intensity or extensive systems as opposed to intensive systems such as direct seeding for plantation establishment. So what are some advantages of the intensive systems? They tend to require the least early planning. They generally require the least number of regular activities requiring cost and the use of professional assistant. They very often provide the highest incomes for the landowner, and they provide the highest rates of return on the investment capital. That is, the money the landowner spent out of his or her pocket to practice forestry. They very often allow for the management of the best adapted species because they allow for managing the highest value species, which are usually the sun lovers. So if income is the goal, making the maximum rate of return on the money spent out of pocket for forestry, it's often going to be the more intensive systems, and it's why, for instance, forest industry uses almost only intensive systems. There are some disadvantages to intensive systems. They're the least aesthetically pleasing. They may be downright ugly initially. They require the highest initial, that is at the beginning, investment for things like site preparation and planting. And therefore, they may have the most money at risk in case of fire, insects, disease, or downward changes in markets. And there's another risk in that even though you're using an intensive system, you may end up still getting an overstocked stand even though you plant trees or do direct seeding that may require some intervention in those early ages that requires additional money to be spent out of pocket. Well, there are also advantages of the low intensity or extensive systems. They may maintain a continuous canopy or at least avoid a complete clear cut in the case of, for instance, seed tree or shelterwood. They may require less upfront investment, that is, they're less capital intense. And somehow, to many people, they just somehow seem more environmentally friendly. There are some disadvantages. They require timing, as we put in this bullet, timing, timing, and timing. You have to plan for and prepare for successful use of the extensive or less intensive systems. They often require more frequent professional involvement, all of which costs money. You may not have as much money to spend at one time up front, but you may instead be spending money at different intervals. It can be difficult to find contractors with the right skills and equipment to help set these up and do the periodic harvesting. It may be difficult, frankly, to find a forester who's comfortable with these extensive, less intensive systems. And they tend to promote a mix of species that will include less marketable species. And part of that has to do with the fact that you're going to get oftentimes more shade tolerant or at least shade intermediate species. And oftentimes they yield over a long period of time lower total income and lower rates of return on investment. So now talking a little more about clear cuts. In clear cuts, we remove all trees in a stand regardless of the size and the species. We're basically getting rid of everything. Clear cuts are used to harvest and regenerate fast-growing, light-demanding species such as loblolly pine, white pine, yellow poplar, and hardwoods. Overall wildlife habitat and diversity can be improved. And a good example is our national forest in the mountains, where clear cuts have largely not been used extensively for many, many decades in the mountains. So now, if you're a wildlifer, one of your complaints about the way the national forests have been managed in western North Carolina is there's no longer a patchwork of age classes, which has led to a decrease in habitat diversity and thus wildlife diversity. Clear cuts are often the most economical method for harvesting, because basically you're not asking loggers to be careful around trees that are targeted for leaving. Clear cuts tend to favor the shade intolerant or sun-loving species, which are usually the fastest growing, and the goal tends to be to control or get rid of residuals either by cutting them or running over them with equipment that are larger than an inch in diameter. Clear cuts are applicable for refurbishing high-graded stands that have high potential productivity. We tend in our group in Extension Forestry to talk about clear cutting these high-graded and no longer merchantable stems as hitting the reset button and getting it back into productive forestry. For implementation, implementation favors logging systems that damage or destroys the aerial or crown portion of all residual trees so that they're not going to be a factor in the new stand. They maximize soil scarification if the goal is for pine, which require bare soil to germinate. You want to harvest trees at a stump height less than 12 inches, especially if your goal is to promote hardwood regeneration, because hardwood stems that grow from a low stump tend to be more viable than from a high stump where branches or sprouts on the side of the stem tend to break off often before they get mature, grow up to be very large. Implementing clear cut also you may require controlling, and allows you to control residuals within 6 months of the harvest. So you'll very often get a lot of sprouting from harvest. Shearing is a preferred method for obtaining natural regeneration, and shearing is a method in which a large crawler tractor has a blade outfitted, and it removes the stems of less desirable small trees or even intermediate-sized trees that may be left following the commercial harvest. It severs those, kind of sets everything back to ground zero, and can help with promoting seed catchment and seed germination and successful growth of young regenerated natural regeneration. There is a practice following clear cutting of site preparation called drum chopping, which is not nearly in vogue as much as it used to be, because drum chopping tends to promote poor quality coppice regeneration and often increases the extensiveness of Japanese honeysuckle when it's present. For seed trees, seed tree reproduction tends to favor shade-intolerant, light-seeded species, because you need tree species where the seed will blow for some distance, because you're not leaving as many seed trees as you would for shelterwood. Requires leaving 6 to 15 trees per acre. I think a previous slide we said a few less than that, but a few number of trees. Seed trees then later are removed or deadened once a regeneration count has been done and determined that you now have an adequate number of new target species trees that have come into the stand. They tend not to have, seed tree is not especially valuable in regenerating southern hardwoods. It's economically and biologically impractical when seed can be present in the duff, such as with yellow poplar, or where seed can easily be distributed by wind and water. It's just simply not needed in those cases. So seed trees, not a method that's used very often for hardwoods. We'll see that see shelterwood in a minute, which does have some application in hardwood. Shelterwood is done when a mature stand is removed in a series of partial cuts. It's suited to species or sites where shelter is needed for new reproduction. It tends to favor trees of intermediate shade tolerance and faster growing shade intolerant species. And it does tend to allow some control of species composition through selection of species during the initial cuts. And we're not going very much into depth on how shelterwood is accomplished. That's done in semester-long courses, but again, it's done in a series of cuts that begin actually several years in advance of your main timber harvest, and it's at that time that some less desirable species can be taken out in these early cuts to begin to promote a seed catchment of only the more desirable species. So now we want to talk about uneven age management. Again, also considered low intensity. We'll talk about single tree selection and group selection. Group selection, similar to single tree selection, it may be modified to favor intermediate species. Trees are removed in even age groups with openings ranging in size from a 1/10 acre to a 1/2 acre. So you might view them as very small patch clear cuts. They do have really great application on places like stream borders, recreation areas where you're trying to maintain mostly an older stand of trees but begin to accomplish regeneration, where areas have high aesthetic value, such as recreation areas. And group selection tends to require less commitment to detail. And we'll contrast that to single tree selection, where you have to have frequent harvest if you're going to achieve multiple ages. It requires a lot of tree marking and expense. You have to have contractors that know how to take extreme care in logging because they're taking out stems that are surrounded by trees that you want to leave and not scar up. It can be difficult or impossible in some cases to market trees like that, but it's used in managing the most shade-tolerant species. For single tree selection, very often you enter the stand to do activities at about a 10-year interval, and in doing so you remove the largest, poorest trees, the low quality and less desirable species. Again, in terms of difficulties, you're entering the stand more frequently, and it can be difficult to control residual damage when the single stems at a time are being harvested. The harvest goal is to enhance desired reproduction, enhance growth through crop tree release, where large or future large targeted trees, high-value trees, are left, and for a final big harvest somewhere down the road. And single tree selection can be used for maintaining a particular desired stand structure where you have different sizes and different ages, and either for aesthetic or wildlife reasons, it's a goal. There are some things to watch out for, though. There is kind of a tendency to remove the largest and high-quality trees, which ends up being what we call a high grade that we discussed earlier. Where do you do these? Application, hardwood tracts smaller than 50 acres, stream borders, much like group selection, recreation areas, and areas of high aesthetic value. For even-age systems, to be an even-age system, the age of the trees, that is the differences from the oldest to the youngest, should be less than 20% of the rotation age of the stand. So you want a pretty narrow distribution of ages in the stand. It tends to favor intermediate to shade intolerant species. And this graph happens to be of a stand that's considered an even age stand. So you tend to have a not very wide difference in the ages in the stand, and consequently your diameters tend to be somewhat clustered tightly around a mean. And we'll contrast that to what you would expect and what your goal would be for an uneven age system, where you're maintaining a similar basal area per age class, basal area being the area of a tree stem at 4.5 feet above the ground. So you can imagine for a smaller diameter trees, if you were to maintain for a diameter class same basal area as a larger diameter, you're going to have more of those smaller trees. And you see this diameter distribution of an uneven age stand. The smaller the trees, the more trees per acre you have to maintain a similar basal area across the diameter classes. And in the even age systems, you tend to favor shade intolerant species. In planning for regeneration, always remember, key to success is information. Information on the condition and size class distribution, quantity and condition of understory trees, quantity and condition of advanced reproduction. For intermediate age treatments, such as timber stand improvements, there are different kinds of timber stand improvements, such as a release cut that regulates species composition and improves quality in very young stand, or improvement cuts that are used for the same purpose as release, but the stands are older, or thinning, which controls stand growth through adjustments in stand density and may result in modest income. Sometimes in improvement cuts, especially in hardwoods, where you're mostly focusing growth on the fewer and best trees, sometimes it's so little value that trees are cut and left in place, producing no income for the landowner. And for final harvest, please note, the cleaner the logging job, the better. And now, because it's more intense, it's an intensive system, best management practices are now required in states to minimize soil damage and off-site impacts, especially water. And BMPs for biomass harvest can also help, because biomass harvests tend to be among some of the most intensive harvests. And always when doing final harvest, beware of high graders, where all the big and best trees are cut, leaving the smaller and worse trees, which devalues the forest, shifts to lower value species, cuts future profits, and diminishes habitat. And oftentimes now in thinnings, in plantations, thinnings are done with what are called buyer select sales, meaning the person operating the piece of equipment chooses the trees that are to be selected. And if you have someone who is less than ethical, you can end up with a degraded stand, because it basically ends up being a type of high grade. Remember the importance of markets, especially future markets. They should influence these management decisions on management practices that we've talked about. And this is just an example. For instance, pulpwood markets have persisted in going offshore. We saw a lot of really big reductions in the pulpwood industry in the 90s, but now we see that energy wood and other markets like OSB have partly been taking up the markets that pulpwood markets have been, the pulpwood in markets that have been going down in recent years. So the markets for the intermediate thinnings that are done in plantations have actually, in some cases, improved despite a bit of a decline in the paper industry. So pulpwood markets for paper have somewhat stabilized in the U.S., especially North Carolina, but nationally they've been decreasing about 2.5% annually. And again, things like OSB and energy have been taking their place. So, what does all this mean? Pulpwood thinnings usually are still possible depending on the proximity to mill, so you can still plant trees, such as loblolly pine, at the spacings we used to recommend when we had a more robust paper industry because other products have come in to take their place. With regards to future markets, we should also note that there are over 200 million acres of new fast-growing plantations worldwide. What does that mean? Well, when you look at that, that the very fast-grown, lesser quality trees are being grown at other places in the world, and when you factor that with the fact that the Pacific Northwest has been displaced by the Southeast has now become the nation's wood basket for higher quality trees. So long-term markets for quality pine in the Southeast are expected to be strong, but there are shorter downturns that will occur and do occur from time to time. Finally, in thinking about markets, any economically viable forest management regime is relatively intensive, even when the intensive forestry is not practiced and instead the extensive or lower. All forestry is considered to be intensive by many people who drive down the road seeing trees being cut. And landowners should be aware of that. Second, despite the change towards landowners being interested in objectives besides timber income, income is indeed important. As we noted, 75% of landowners still require. Economically viable forestry has required economies of scale such that many less intensive practices are not practical, however appealing. So these are sort of some final notes to keep in mind. And with that, this is the end of this video.